Hi, I'm Talia Baroncelli, and you're watching theAnalysis-news. I'll shortly be joined by Peter Carter to speak about climate change, as well as the military's role in exacerbating the climate crisis. But first, please do go to our website, theanalysis.news, and hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. You can also sign up to our newsletter. That way you'll be informed of all of our future updates and shows. Back in a bit. Joining me now is Peter Carter. He's a retired physician and founder of the Climate Emergency Institute. Peter has worked intensely on reports on climate change over the years and also served as an expert reviewer for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, including on their working assessment in 2014 and on their special report in 2018. So I'm very happy to have you here, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always a pleasure and a good opportunity. Thank you.
We've just passed the 1 year mark of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So it would be a good opportunity to actually speak about how the military and how ongoing conflicts contribute to climate change.
Well, I think firstly, um, I'm following this war because for most of my life I've been interested and involved one way or another in disarmament and peace. So the outbreak of this war was really a horrible shock to me. And it's just got more and more shocking, right? As you say, incredibly, this war is now 1 year long. It is, in the words of the Rand Corporation, and they should know, this is one of the most bloodiest wars in history. As you know, it's degenerated into a World War One type trench war, and as well as, of course, the most modern, horrible, heavy weapons being used in this. Ukraine is a large country in the middle of Europe. Um, but there's another reason for me to be interested in this, and more than a little alarmed, because um, we are um, we are not only at the brink, we're beyond the brink with regards to our global emissions, CO2 emissions, of course, primarily from burning fossil fuels, and not being able to avoid in the near future, in a few decades, catastrophic climate change by surpassing the catastrophic limit of 2 degrees C global average temperature. So the IPCC, in their last assessment, repeatedly said that to avoid 1.5 degrees C, which is now too late, and to avoid 2 degrees C, emissions have to decline immediately. They repeated this over and over, and on a rapid basis. So there could be nothing worse for our climate security and for our climate future and being able to avoid climate catastrophe than a hot war. Um, the war is, of course, being fought with fossil fuels. The amount that the military burns in the way of fossil fuels is absolutely unbelievable. I think many people have heard that the United States military, as a institution, if you like, is the single largest source of CO2 emissions, and you can add in tanks and howitzers and everything like that. But that's compounded by the fact that we have to have unprecedented international cooperation in order to put global emissions into immediate decline. And the war has absolutely scuppered, uh, ruled out, made completely impossible that type of cooperation because we have the large emitters, we have China, we have the Russian Federation, and we have the United States in very unfriendly international relationships. So, and the armaments industry, of course, has always been a big driver of warfare, as well as the big global banks. In this sense, warfare is at the same time the worst and the best of businesses. because of course the Raytheon and Northrop and companies like that in the United States are making vast profits now, and they continue to make vast profits because, as you may have heard, Ukraine is running out of ammunition, and we're talking heavy ammunition. We're talking big stuff. And the United States weapons armaments producers are ramping up their production of these shells. It's absolutely terrible. I mean, it is completely insane. It's despicable. It is shocking to see all of these once beautiful towns and cities in the country of Ukraine being absolutely demolished. And the longer, of course, this situation continues and the more damage is being done, the less likely it is for us to have this international cooperation.
Right. Well, you mentioned the military and that report by Professor Netta Crawford from Brown University, in which she illustrated how the U.S. Department of Defense is the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in the world. And just
Yeah.
by looking at how the United States and how Europe as well sort of write their climate change commitments and their commitments to achieving net zero emissions by 2050, they often don't include those military emissions in their commitments. And so I wonder, I mean, without including those huge numbers and the fact that the military, I mean, the US military emits more than, I think, Portugal and Sweden together or something insane like that.
Yeah.
So how can we even meet those commitments without addressing the role of the military in greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, the fact is, and the IPCC, of course, has been reporting and telling us this for many years, um, our sort of buzzword target is now net zero. But the IPCC is very clear that net zero requires zero fossil fuels. So the fossil fuel industry has to come to a close. And it has to come to a close very quickly. And of course, it can do, because we've also known for years and years and years that all of our fossil fuel energy, polluting, planet, future destroying fossil fuel energy, energy can be replaced 100% by this amazing, clean, zero carbon, non combustion energy. Um, but the war also reminds me certainly that at the background of driving global emissions are, of course, at an all-time high again. Not only that, emissions are increasing at an all-time high rate. So we couldn't be in a worse situation as regards what we're doing with our climate and our planet, and we couldn't be in a worse situation with regards to um, I mean, this war is, frankly, it's pretty obvious. It's being encouraged. It's being pushed, right? This is now seen as an insane competition between the United States and NATO, yes, and the Russian Federation. And of course, people are getting worried and very reasonably worried about the nuclear threat yet again, because both of these countries have large numbers of nuclear weapons, much less than they had 30, 40 years ago, but certainly enough to do our planet in. And of course, the latest bad news is that President Putin has said he's withdrawing from the nuclear weapons control treaty, which had been actually operating up to now. So we really do have a risk of world-ending nuclear war, but we have a certain future of a world-destroying climate catastrophe if the war continues and we don't achieve peace, and therefore we don't have the cooperation necessary to put emissions into rapid decline.
Well, a few months ago, we saw world leaders meet at the UN climate change conference, COP27, in Egypt. And my impression was that they were just patting themselves on the back for having all sorts of innovative strategies to combat climate change. But I think they were overstating how innovative or successful these strategies are. I mean, you heard Biden saying that by 2030, they'd be able to reduce emissions by 40%, given what they've done with the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, do you buy that?
You're totally right. The ideas and the proposals that the international community puts out, they're good. And also proposals that civil society puts out, but they are minuscule and have zero effect all the time we are emitting at all, at all. So yes, it's all very nice, but I think it's rather time wasting. I mean, I just can't believe how these conferences go on every year. They last for 2 weeks, and then they sort of go into overtime, and they achieve absolutely nothing apart from a new buzzword, right? So we've had road maps, and we've had pathways, and we've had action years, and it just goes on and on. And one of the media made a comment that the activity at COP27 appeared to be more in the way of making deals with respect to primarily fossil fuel energy, rather than making deals to put emissions into decline. Um, uh, there's um, there's absolutely no political will to do what has to be done. The science is absolutely definite that what has to be done for us to have a future at all. The IPCC sixth assessment, once again, was a brilliant assessment, but I don't think the world's got the message. They use terms like we now have to secure a livable future. When the IPCC, the highly conservative Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is using that kind of language, you know that we're in dire, dire trouble, which we are. So, yeah, they're unbelievable time wasters. And, they can talk about net zero and they can talk about net zero forever, frankly, but it means nothing without putting fossil fuel emissions to zero. And the IPCC has been definite on that for many years now. So a lot of this is avoiding what governments must do, not only in the light of Paris Agreement, but also to comply with the 1992 United Nations Climate Change Convention. Not to mention their moral, ethical, and governing responsibility to provide today's young people in the future with a livable future. They are going to live through terrible times. It's too late for us to avoid that now. The other thing that they talk about a lot is 1.5 degrees C. So we've heard since the very excellent 2018 IPCC 1.5 degrees C report, um, we've heard that global emissions have to be cut 50% in 10 or so years, and we have to reach net zero by 2050. That, by the way, is the longest that the scientists think we might wait to get net zero. So the institutions and organizations that say we have to get to net zero well before 2050 are absolutely right, and they're right by the science. 1.5 degrees C is we cannot possibly limit to 1.5 degrees C. That should be obvious pretty well to anybody that's been following what the climate change and the global temperatures have been doing. And pretending that we can limit to 1.5 degrees C is really, 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 it's unbelievably irresponsible. It's sort of, I guess people call it hopium. No, what we have to do is to um, get together on the disastrous future that we have with 1.5 degrees C. It's globally disastrous. And according to the IPCC, we will be there around 2032. So that's no time ahead. So the years that we have, governments should be preparing the world to withstand the 1.5 degrees C disasters. And here they are. Instead of doing that, they're frankly they're making war. And another thing that we could discuss is that we've never left the war economy. Eisenhower was so right. Since the huge ramp up of the world economy, particularly the United States and also European nations subsequently, after the Bretton Woods Agreement, we have stayed on basically a war-based economy, right? And we're now seeing how all of these countries, you know, have these awful weapons. They're all weapons of mass destruction, in my view, and they're all coming out of the woodwork now. Um, so yeah, there is a economy and a consciousness of war and the paranoia of war that is driving the production of increasing amounts of fossil fuels and planning on continuing to have more fossil fuels. So we have to make the peace.
But just to be clear, going back to what you were saying with 1.5-degree warming, I mean, this is something that's not reversible at this stage, right? Like, we're definitely going to make 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. The question is whether we can stop it hitting 2 degrees Celsius. And then what happens after that? Is 2 degrees a tipping point that then leads to further disasters and
Well, yeah, I tell you, the international community has always realized that 2 degrees C is a sort of end of the world limit. 2 degrees C was first proposed in the mid 1990s by the EU. It became sort of formalized at the Copenhagen Agreement. In fact, the Copenhagen COP back in 2009 or whenever the heck that was. But that's where 2 degrees started, and in actual fact, where governments responded to the most vulnerable and least developed nations, Africa and the others, that they said they would look at 1.5 degrees C. So they'd been looking at 1.5 degrees for years and years and years. Then the IPCC was persuaded to do a 1.5 degree C report, and everybody was shocked, absolutely shocked, at how disastrous 1.5 degrees C is. 2 degrees C is the end of our world, and the research that's been going on and on has shocked scientists because it is far worse, and the tipping points, as you mentioned, are far closer than really the models had ever projected. So recently, we've had several actually really good papers, in so much as they're hopefully very, very useful to drive the lackluster, totally irresponsible political will that we see. Um, uh, we have to look after today's children, right? We have to look after today's young people. That should be the focus. Focus should not be on war, and the focus should not be on economic benefits. The focus should be on humanity, which is our children and our young people. And their appeals, by the way, even legal appeals, have been fought by their own governments, and their appeals have been completely rejected. And so we see emissions, all emissions at record levels, increasing at record rates. And also, we are now the scientists have again been very shocked and confirmed it, that we're now in the worst nightmare situation that environmentalists like myself who've been around at least some time ever imagined, because we've now into methane feedback. And that really is, again, an end of the world situation if governments don't put emissions into decline right away. I mean, Hossein Lee, who was the chair of the IPCC, in the Madrid COP, which is 2 COPs ago. I was at that one. And at the formal opening plenary, Dr. Lee stated quite definitely that to avoid 1.5 degrees C, emissions have to be put into immediate and rapid decline. And he said the same thing the year later at the Glasgow COP. But this time he said that in order to avoid 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C, we have to put emissions into immediate and rapid decline. The media are not putting this out. They have been irresponsible and most unhelpful on that, because there's never been a more important scientific statement than that. So it really isn't out there. And the war, the atmosphere and the media attention and the fears and worries of everybody completely removes the planet-destroying situation of our accelerating greenhouse gas emissions with the warming wetlands around the world, tropical wetlands and northern wetlands, because they've been warming up for years and years and years, and they normally emit some methane. They are now emitting more methane. And atmospheric methane has literally exploded. Literally, in the past few years, it has exploded. And the scientists are doing very good work on this. They're confirming that it is methane. They're confirming where the methane is coming from. But of course, in the international situation that we're in, I don't think anybody's listening to them.
Well, methane is one of the most potent greenhouse gases, right? And we just saw in September, we saw the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines, which was a methane explosion, which, it released so much methane into the Baltic Sea by, the sabotage of this pipeline. And we could, discuss who is responsible for that or who is behind that. I mean, Seymour Hersh has his theory, and highly likely. I don't know.
It's another shocking evidence of international insanity, right? I mean, whoever blew up the pipeline, I mean, they're completely out of their minds, right? Um, uh, it settled down, of course, but we have excellent satellites now, particularly Europe, by the way, a Copernicus program, but NASA, of course, has excellent satellites too. And so they can now actually pinpoint where methane is coming from. And of course, from of course, we saw that massive amount bubbling on the surface of the sea there. So that was the largest single plume that's ever been recorded. But we have plumes all over the planet because we're fracking. We're fracking the planet for natural gas and oil, and coal emits methane. So we have methane emissions from all three all three fossil fuels, because natural gas is mainly methane. And of course, we've got, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of pipelines and stations that they use to control the methane, but it's large. NASA actually very recently published a map which showed in detail fossil fuel methane emissions. And it's, of course, largely the northern hemisphere. But the most focused, concentrated amount of methane that's coming out is coming from the Russian European pipelines. It's really quite dramatic. not the amount total, but the fine concentration emission which the satellites can pick up. It's very, very high indeed. And so that's a big problem, huge problem with natural gas, because of course all the countries thought that natural gas was a great thing, and so they're fracking the heck out of the planet, including where I live. I'm afraid in British Columbia, in our north, we have a huge so-called deposit of shale gas which is being fracked.
Well, big oil and big gas are huge proponents of certain techniques such as carbon capture and storage and sequestration, but they primarily engage in these different techniques in order to get more oil out of the ground or more gas out of the ground. Do you think that carbon capture and storage is a viable solution or a mechanism to reach certain climate goals?
Well, CCS has been around for a very long time. The IPCC did a special report on carbon capture and storage. I think it was back in 2010. Um, uh, and, we've had scientific research. And as you say, now the fossil fuel industry is talking more and more carbon capture and storage. You may remember that the Secretary of State that President Trump chose at the time was the CEO of Exxon, Mr. Tillerson. And of course, when he was put through the vetting committee, he was asked whether he believed in climate change because President Trump had said it was a hoax. Tillerson said, "Yeah, we believe in climate change. It's a problem, but it's an engineering problem." So that shows you, doesn't it? Right from the top. Um, uh, they don't believe. I mean, nobody can believe that you can solve climate change by anything. Carbon capture storage is the one that's been mentioned, but anything all the time. We're emitting 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide a year, year after year after year. It is more than stupid. Um, we forget in our sort of scientific discussions, particularly, but also in our international relationship discussions, uh, we forget the ethics, right? We forget the morality, right? Um, uh, um, and the public isn't really understanding what's at stake here because it's not being communicated. In 2018, I co-authored a book called Unprecedented Crime, Unprecedented Crime, The Denial of Global Climate Change. And there's been a lot more published in the way of articles on that climate crime, which is, of course, the continued deception by the fossil fuel industry, and claiming that they've all joined. I think they've all jumped on the bandwagon, the fossil fuel corporations of net zero, right? Because net zero just by itself, I mean, it can mean anything or nothing. It has to be zero combustion, by the way. We cannot. The burning age is over. We cannot burn any more fossil fuels. And my God, we're going back to coal
I was
again.
about to say, I mean, Germany has been
The
burning
IEA,
coal.
the International Energy Agency, which is yeah, yeah. I mean, it's completely unbelievable. Coal remains the single biggest fossil fuel source of CO2 emissions. So it's by far the biggest source of CO2 emissions. That's the burning of coal, and it is at an all-time high. And the IEA and the people that follow energy say that coal will stay at an all-time high at least until 2025. So obviously, of course, coal, as everybody knows, is the worst fossil fuel. But coal is a killer. Coal kills 10 million people a year. That's the burning of coal, and we don't need to be burning anything. And we cannot be burning anything if we want to have a future. If we want to consider our responsibilities and our love, of course, to our families, to our children, and to the natural world. Um, uh, Life is dying around us before our very eyes, right? We're in the sixth extinction already. And fossil fuel emissions, and I try to remind myself to talk emissions rather than climate change all the time, because the other problem is people are not connecting these dots, right? Mm. Why do we have methane feedback? Well, we have it because we're emitting CO2 and methane. We're burning it in vast, vast amounts. And all our plans are to increase the amounts of fossil fuels that we burn. I saw a commander um, uh, um, on the YouTube just the other day. There are very brave reporters and journalists gone into the front there to talk with the Ukrainian forces, and they were saying that they think this is going to go on for years. Um, uh, um, uh, what do you call them? Defense writers from the United States say that this war looks like it's going to go on for years. Um, uh, this, if this war carries on, right, it's devastating Ukraine. You know, Ukraine had beautiful towns and cities, absolutely beautiful, and they're being, I mean, it's heart wrenching. They're being brought down to rubble, absolute rubble. I couldn't believe a city that I saw in the east, which is still being contested in the east of Ukraine. There is no city left. It looked just like Hiroshima. You couldn't see anything but rubble and dust and little black spokes pointing out of the ground, which used to be trees. It's absolutely unbelievable what's happening. In 2023, in the middle of Europe, and people are talking about winning this war. They're talking about who's going to win. Well, we're losing
Yeah,
everything.
exactly. What does winning the war mean in this context? I think the different scenarios I can play out are really brutal and disconcerting. But you would also hope that this war would present an opportunity for countries to rethink their economies. And I mean, Russia, for example, is so heavily dependent on gas, and it's, you know, the way that it gets gas out of the ground and sells that to different countries, you know, now primarily more to China and to India than to Western countries, as we know. But in Western Europe, Germany didn't revert to renewables. They started burning coal, getting LNG from Qatar. I mean, do you think that nuclear energy might be a solution here, or is renewables the way to go?
Well, you know, we're in a most evil situation, right? Humanity has never been in a more dire, risky situation with climate change. That's been said many times now. But with this war as well, and with our governments pouring subsidies into the fossil fuel industry, the IEA reported very recently that 2022 was a record year for subsidies by far. The governments gave the fossil fuel industry double the amount of subsidies in 2022 that they gave in 2021. And that's a strategy for planetary destruction and to leave an unlivable future for today's children and young people. And so, just like war, that is a greatest of great evils. Terrible, despicable, you know. It's unbelievable that the governments would be doing this. So, yeah, I take your point, and I think it's a good one. If everybody could see the complete insanity, let alone there's nothing good going to come out of this war. All that's going to come out of this war is destruction. So if countries could get together and negotiate a peace, and at the same time, this war should be driving them to get off fossil fuel energy much, much, much faster. They're not getting off fossil fuel energy at all, okay? Um, uh, but also, as you point out, drive the industry to more renewable energy. But for that to happen, the people have to force the governments to stop their evil fossil fuel subsidies. That's the absolute necessity. And that's unbelievable too, because I did do a bit of research on this myself many years ago. And at least since 1990, there have been World Bank, OECD, IEA, they have all produced reports that there's no justification for subsidizing fossil fuels whatsoever on an economic, environmental, nor a social equity development business basis. Um, uh, they say that that subsidies are damaging in all three sectors, in all three aspects. So that's why I say the war is certainly the sum of all evils, but giving subsidies to the fossil fuel industry is the ultimate of all evils. And but we require two things. We require a huge amount of public pressure, political will, right, to stop the war, right, and then to get back and establish a peaceful situation. You know, there's a huge difference between fossil fuels and renewable energy that's been pointed out for many, many years. Um, Fossil fuel energy, by its very nature, tends to encourage hostility and warfare because people are protecting their very localized but very huge deposits of fossil fuels and trying to, by using war, to steal other people's. Renewable energy is completely different, right? Renewable energy is distributed everywhere, right? Every house can produce renewable energy. So there's no incentive um, uh, to use warfare if you have a renewable energy energized planet and civilization. And this has always been a great hope of mine and many other people. Um, but it has to start tomorrow.
I think what also is important, though, is that this is not the only ongoing conflict. I mean, of course, the war in Ukraine dominates the headlines, um, especially in Europe and in the Western world because of the proximity. But there have been conflicts going on in other parts of the world, in Africa and Asia, for decades, and also the way that private militaries help transnational corporations go about wealth extraction must contribute to climate change. And I feel that we need to be thinking about all these other conflicts that are funded by governments, big corporations, and also private military, such as, you know, the Wagner Group, and how they assist in these illegal wealth extraction endeavors. So I think, you know, hopefully there will be a negotiated settlement at some point, but that's not the only um, battle that's ongoing. I mean, there are different forms of economic warfare that are going on as well. So I feel like we need to be thinking about all sorts of different issues and have a more holistic approach as opposed to a one issue approach. And that brings me to what our strategy should be, because oftentimes you hear politicians say that, you know, consumers need to decide where they want to put their money. They have a certain amount of purchasing power and they can make informed decisions to prevent climate change. And I'm not saying that people should, you know, shouldn't become vegetarian or stop flying or whatever else it might be. But to me, that almost sounds like they're trying to distract from the real sources of greenhouse gas emissions, which is the fossil fuel industry. So I wonder what you think of that messaging.
Well, I think you bring up two huge important points there. And it seems that there's war everywhere. I agree with you. And there's conflict everywhere, particularly in the poorest and most climate change vulnerable nations. um, because, as you point out, um, they're being exploited. And the um, the nations where the worst conflict, of course, still carries on, like you say, are the oil, the nations that hold oil. Some of them obscenely wealthy, like Saudi Arabia, but some of them are countries that are poor, but they sit on oil. And I can remember, uh, I think it was a military person from the United States who made a very rotten but telling joke during the Iraq invasion, which was, why are those people sitting on our oil anyway? And big economies like the United States, like the EU, like China, and like the Russian Federation, these big economies who are big because they burn a lot of fossil fuels, um, uh, which is making the future. Every year we're burning fossil fuels, we're making the future worse um, uh, for our progeny, for the future humanity. So we have to create a global civilization that says no more war, right? Um, uh, War is our human civilization's greatest vice. And we learn this over and over and over, right? But we're learning it again, and yet we're doing nothing. So we have to have a world free of war. You're so right. It's everywhere, and it's being driven by investment, by big investment, and that's being driven by the big banks, right? So the big banks, who are um, uh, see, banks have only one function, that is to make the most money in the fastest time. There's no other consideration whatsoever. So it's not surprising that if we look back in history, the big banks have always been behind the big wars. So, and you mentioned the economy. The economy, of course, has to transform. We've known this for decades, and many people have written a lot of good work about that. It's a destructive consumerist economy. And yes, they're right in a sense. We're all responsible. I mean, I'm responsible, but we all have to get together, right? And public has to drive the political will and say that we don't want to have a world which is continually at war. Because when you say there's war everywhere, you're right. That means there's war continuing everywhere. It never stops, never stops. And it's time to beat those swords, beat those swords at the plowshares, which is the famous peace group based on the biblical quote.
I do remember an OCCPR report on corruption in Afghanistan and how Ashraf Ghani, the former Afghan president, his brother was basically involved in some sort of illegal mineral extraction, and they were coordinating with this company that was that had Paul Wolfowitz on their board. I mean, it's just incredible
Right,
how
right.
different private military groups and governments and security firms are kind of all in cahoots and in bed with one another in conflict zones for the purpose of profit. So obviously capitalism here and this lust for never ending profits and wealth accumulation is behind a lot of climate change.
Yeah, we have allowed the corporations and capitalism to grow into a global monster, right? Um, uh, um, it was David C. Corton who wrote the book um, uh, um, "When Corporations Rule the World," and they do. And primarily the big banking corporations, the big fossil fuel corporations, the big chemical corporations, but also the big agribusiness corporation. The nation state is inherently a source of problem. Nation states were the boundaries are all unnatural. The boundaries and the states are all produced by war, every single one of them, even Canada, although it was a tiny war. And their function, what they see as their sort of main aspect of their economy is conflict and war. And I remember you saying now that our economy is like a war, and that's absolutely right. It's called the competitive economy, a competitiveness of national economies, right? Um, uh, but it's a hostility, and it breeds hostility and fear. Um, so um, we hear too much and we think far too much about people who we call as leaders, who are leaders in warfare and who are leaders in emitting greenhouse gases and continuing the emission of greenhouse gases. One of the things that the 1.5 degrees C 2018 report by the IPCC stressed was that we had to have fundamental change in all sectors of society in order to control the temperature so it doesn't reach 1.5 degrees C. That was a great paragraph that they wrote there, and we have to change completely. There has to be total transformation. Um, Conversion is the only way to mitigate climate change. So um, uh, we doing less, like the corporations say, being more efficient, like the energy corporations say. It doesn't work for climate change. You have to stop and convert. That's very obvious in the case of fossil fuels, that we have to stop burning all fossil fuels. And EU, you have to stop burning wood on an industrial basis too, and stop importing the forests from the United States. That has to stop. They're emitting just as bad as coal, by the way. Um, uh, those big so-called biomass sources of energy, um, uh, and 100% renewable energy that can be simply done by the governments not subsidizing the fossil fuel energy anymore. One would hope, and I can't see any reason why, that can't be turned around in 1 to 2 years. But everything else has to be transformed as well. Dietary habits have to be transformed. We do have to go vegan because we cannot afford to emit any more methane. Atmospheric methane has increased far more than any greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. It's now running at 1,925 parts per billion. And that is an increase on the pre-industrial by a factor of 2.6 times higher atmospheric methane than when we started with our fossil fuel civilization. Um, uh, and as I say, it is absolutely skyrocketing. It's going ahead. So we cannot put any more methane into the environment. So those that are encouraging a switch to the vegan diet, yeah, all power to you, um, uh, because of the cows. Unfortunately, there is a good trend to veganism, I think, in North America, maybe in Europe. But of course, in the so-called developing countries in Asia, they're following our bad examples, like they're doing it every other way, and eating more and more and more. So everything else transformed. Our construction. If you go to anywhere in the world, I mean anywhere, you can go to the sort of so-called poorest regions, you will see only one form of construction: steel, concrete, aluminum, and glass. Nothing could be worse. And we have excellent alternatives, some publicity being given to them as well. Multi-story buildings being made with wood, with engineered wood that can last hundreds and hundreds of years. Like you can see buildings, sizable buildings in UK and Europe that have been there for hundreds of years. Um, uh, So, and we have to stop deforestation completely. Um, we're tending to forget the scientific sort of rules that we understood 10 or 15, 20 years ago. And one of those rules was stop deforestation. We're not sort of talking in that way now. We're talking about, well, perhaps we can reduce deforestation. You know, perhaps it's going to be better because we've got a more sane and sensible president in Brazil. But the international community uh, has to stop deforestation, and they can stop deforestation. So we have to make these conversions. And the biggest conversion, uh, which is out of my sort of expertise to make, but the biggest conversion is the ethical, spiritual conversion. And Pope Francis, who has been quite a champion on climate change, and that's a very fine thing. He reiterated actually Pope Benedict's statement that Benedict made in the United Nations, which is that we need an ecological spiritual conversion. I thought that was great. And Francis has said it as well.
Yeah, we keep setting the bar lower and lower in terms of what we want to achieve, and it's pretty sad to see that.
Yeah, that's totally what we're doing. Yeah, we're allowing the bars to be set lower. That's a very good way of saying it.
And my final question to you would be, the role of the global south in terms of mitigating climate change. I think, we're all feeling the effects of climate change in North America, in Europe. This is something that's not just affecting poorer countries. We're all feeling it. But in certain
Right.
instances, poorer countries in the global south are often um, hit harder by climate change. When it comes to food security, for example, we might see more people having to flee their countries and to seek refuge in northern countries, so to leave different African countries and maybe seek asylum in Europe in the upcoming decades. And I think this was a recent item that was put on the agenda at COP27, which is loss and damage. This is the first time where they've discussed potentially giving countries in the global south some form of reparations for what they've suffered as a result of climate change. So I just wonder, what is their role, and can they potentially hold the global north to account?
Well, they've certainly tried hard. I remember, I think it was at Copenhagen that the African delegation got together when they were continuing to try and persuade the global North nations to drop the 2 degree C limit and make it 1.5 degrees C. I remember they threatened to walk out of that conference, and they called what was going on in to their countries. They called it economic genocide. And it most certainly is. We have a situation now, as you know, in the Horn of Africa again. Millions and millions and millions of people are on the edge of starvation. The UN has only been, this is unusual, has only been given 50% of its requests to prevent famine in the Horn of Africa. Could the war in Europe have something to do with that? I damn well think so, because the countries actually have always given in these situations, and they've always avoided the worst. But we've seen some horrible starvations in Africa. Now, of course, we've always known that Africa is the most vulnerable country to climate change. It's a huge continent, but it's absolutely tragic how vulnerable it is to climate change. Um, uh, and it's just a few percentage points, like 3% or something of those orders of Africa and all the countries as a rule to what they've contributed in the way of emissions. But you mentioned the success of loss and damage at the last COP. I'm afraid it wasn't a success for two reasons. One reason, of course, is they're not following through with it, and governments are very, very good at making fine promises, which they never follow through with. They promised at the Pittsburgh G20 back in 2009 to stop fossil fuel subsidies. They're still talking about we will stop fossil fuel subsidies. The bar goes down by the limit being pushed back. So they say, oh, we'll stop them 2025. Loss and damage. Loss and damage is specifically, explicitly in the 1992 Climate Change Convention. It's repeated over and over and over that the Annex 1, which were the long industrially developed nations, had agreed and were required to provide all manner of means of assistance to the Annex 2 countries. So that goes way back to 1992. So what's happened? Annex 1, the industrially developed, wealthy, so-called high credit countries have just roadblocked and roadblocked and roadblocked and prevented. And now they say suddenly that we've agreed to a loss and damage. Well, no, they haven't, because um, in the 1992 convention, the vulnerable countries were listed. They were actually named and listed, the countries which the Annex 1 nations had to assist, technological assistance, uh, damage assistance. That was anticipated in 1992. And I'm afraid it's not happening. You can look around the world and see it's not happening. Um, uh, these, I remember um, uh, um, it was at the conference in Mexico, the COP in Mexico. There was a lady, human rights person, who was the delegation of Bolivia. And she'd not been a delegate in a COP before. And halfway through, she said, this isn't the climate conference at all. This is an economic conference. All they're doing is arguing economic benefits with each other. Um, uh, so this monster of the economy, which we've allowed to be created, um, uh, we have to transform that beast. That's for sure. And we have to look back at the present and the past and the best of humanity. The very best of humanity is is absolutely wonderful individually, culturally, in groups, um, uh, um, and we're looking at the worst because all our news tends to be the very, very worst. So we have to raise our bar. As far as we know, we can raise it, right? And we have to develop, construct, and negotiate a peaceful and peaceable world. If we don't, we just have no future. We have no future at all. And our poor children have no future worth living. As I say, when the IPCC says we have to secure a livable future for them, we have to do it. We have to feel the shame, in my view, of what kind of world um, we have created, and it's a world that's going downhill, downhill with the militarism, downhill with the competitive economics, which is ruling the world. Um, Another aspect which we should mention because it's so important is that the corporations now have managed to relieve themselves of all constraints on their behavior. They've done this in my lifetime. I've seen it happen. And when the world became aware of the WTO many years ago, we saw one of the greatest events in certainly my history. We saw the globalization of the human rights movement, massive marches, peaceful marches. I mean, they were massive in major countries all around the world, year by year, when the WTO was holding these meetings. And the people knew what the economics of the WTO was all about, and they demonstrated very, very powerfully against it. Now, those uh, terrible constraints are still operant because we still have the WTO so-called free trade agreements in operation. And there are dozens and dozens of those agreements now. And what they do is they have, and the corporations have done this on purpose. This has nothing to do with the world's people at all. Corporations brought this in by stealth. It's an artificial, quasi-legal arrangement that they have negotiated between their trade departments, whereby now corporations have the right to sue governments, and they have, and they are. And it's already started in the case of governments who are talking about applying some legislation, right, to reduce the fossil fuel industry, reduce fossil fuel emissions. And the corporations are saying, no, no, because we have this free trade agreement, you see. And if you do that, we will lose future profitability, not just today, in the future. And we're talking tens of billions of dollars that the corporations are suing our governments for. And that is condemning the world to zero future. That's a death sentence for the world when we have fossil fuel corporations and chemical corporations suing our governments to make sure, and they're succeeding, and it's abhorrent. It's another specific evil, preventing our countries doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is protecting their citizens and ensuring a reasonable future for the next generation. These damn corporations, right? Over the past, NAFTA was the first one, of course, to remember the North American Free Trade Agreement. Now we've got dozens and dozens that are all over the place, and they're still being negotiated.
Well, it's not just NAFTA, but also CETA, the free trade agreement between the European Union and Canada. It's been an incredible opportunity for companies to unleash lawsuits against nation states and for them to, basically have a free hand in terms of crushing certain worker standards or basically increasing their own profits. So it hasn't really been great for those workers and countries involved.
It's the most powerful thing that we've got going on in the world, and it's completely artificial and contrived, right? It's had no legal basis whatsoever. But they have invented a law of economics. Um, uh, so yes, and it exerts a chill effect. That's the other big thing, which was anticipated years ago, that governments are afraid now, to exert the legislation or apply the legislation that they've already got. Okay, with regards to mining, pesticides, chemicals, but also with fossil fuels. They're afraid to do that because they've seen the fossil fuel corporations and other corporations win these cases. They have a contrived, what they call a dispute settlement mechanism. And all that is that they hire um, retired lawyers, civil servants, and they make a panel of them, and the panel gets to decide on the under, not under national laws, not under international laws, but under these phony free trade rules. Okay, whether the corporation will prevail. And the corporations have routinely prevailed, as you probably know. So that's another transformation that has to be made. Something else that has to be kicked out with the corporations. Corporations are so powerful now. I can't believe how in my lifetime I've seen the power of the corporations from very little, compared to the power of the nation state. to now corporations have power over the nation states, and the nation states everywhere. United States and Canada, as you mentioned, European countries. Um, uh, and it's an awful thing. And I hope that there are more people that actually write articles about this and get the information out again, because we sort of lost what we learned decades ago. This is a monstrous situation that the corporations have contrived in order to exert power over the people everywhere and power over our democratically elected governments to the extent that they're democratically elected.
Yeah, it's like the rules are
It's
rigged in their
it's horrendous.
favor, in favor of corporate profits.
Oh yeah, the deck is stacked, and so they sue, they bring a complaint, right, against a nation state, against the government, and then they set up these dispute settlement mechanisms, and they negotiate and arbitrate, and it takes time, and normally, this is a very expensive process, by the way. The corporations have sort of unlimited access to credit from the bank when they make these suits, so-called complaints. The governments don't have unlimited funds in their government pockets to fight these cases. So the corporations are killing us, basically, right? The corporations are literally killing us, destroying our future. Um, uh, um, and they have the nerve to pretend that the solution to climate change is engineering.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing all your insights and vast knowledge on this topic. And thank you for watching theAnalysis.news. If you're able to donate to our show, please go to theAnalysis.news and hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. And also get on to our newsletter. That way you won't miss any future episodes. Thank you.